I want to tell you about one of the other people in Vietnam I came to admire like you won't believe. This guy's name was Vo Van Ba. Vo Van Ba. His code name, at least the one that's been declassified, was T.U. Hackle. T.U. Hackle. And he was, without question, along with Nguyen Van Thai, the enemy that I interrogated, the very vessel of bravery, the very vessel of determination. In Vo Van Ba's case, he was a nationalist. He believed in the Southern cause, and he had been, at one point in his career, a communist. In the late 1940s, he had been recruited by the Vietnamese to target students and to try to recruit them to the communist movement. He quickly became disaffected because he discovered that in an effort to win hearts and minds, the communists were killing their potential recruits. Bloodbath was their strategy, not persuasion. Intimidation was their tactic. And he became sickened with what the communists he worked with were doing, and he quit the movement. By the time the Geneva Accords had occurred in 1954, Vo Van Ba, no longer a communist cadre, had moved to Tay Ninh province, in the area just northwest of Saigon, and set up shop as a slash and burn farmer. His wife sold flowers in the local market. Their son, who was still young at the time, would come along. He dodged the draft, the South Vietnamese military draft. Vo Van Ba's farm lay athwart a major access route to the top communist command for the Saigon area and the Delta. The acronym, listen to me, was COSVIN, the Central Office for South Vietnam. That's the name of the communist headquarters for Saigon and the Delta. This is the mothership, baby. This is where all the orders come from. And Vo Van Ba lived just down the road from it. And every time a major communist commander arrived at COSVIN, this communist headquarters, or left it, he would cross Vo Van Ba's farm. And Vo Van Ba began befriending them. The South Vietnamese police found out about this, and they went to Vo Van Ba and said, "We want you to work for us," pretending to work for the communists again. And Vo Van Ba did that. Beginning in 1960, he became an operative for the South Vietnamese police. He, by 1963 and 4, had attracted the attention of CIA case officers working with the police. This was before my tours there in Vietnam. And they began piggybacking police control of Vo Van Ba. So Vo Van Ba became an asset of the CIA as well as the South Vietnamese Special Police Branch. Vo Van Ba was so trusted by the communists that they allowed him to sit in on meetings of the Communist Command. Now, where was this? The Communist Command occupied a cave on Black Virgin Mountain just outside of Tay Ninh City. U.S. bombers had sought, and I had sought many times to locate this headquarters. Vo Van Ba went there for meetings. He would come out with the communists' latest plans, and he'd bring them to his police handlers, and ultimately, when the CIA became involved, his agency handlers. Vo Van Ba was so important as an asset for the police and his CIA handlers that they began working to improve his standing with the communists, to make it appear that he was an effective asset for the communists, so they would trust him, give him more secrets, and he could bring those secrets to our side. And one of the things we did, we being the CIA and the South Vietnamese police, we would stage little episodes. We would blow up roadblocks. We would stage demonstrations, and then let it be known or give Vo Van Ba enough information to make it appear that he'd done it. And so through this sort of false credit work, if you will, he built up incredible trust inside the communist command. Man, this guy was right in the center of things. He was like having a spy in Hitler's bunker. The communists trusted him because we had created a legend that made him appear to be a communist hero. In 1968, Vo Van Ba predicted the Tet Offensive. 5 days beforehand, he passed word to his South Vietnamese police handlers that that offensive was coming. The same intelligence went to the U.S. Embassy and went to the U.S. military. The embassy discounted it. Discounted Vo Van Ba's reporting. The South Vietnamese police and General Frederick Nguyen, who was in charge of American forces around Saigon, believed it. And so at the last minute, they beefed up their strength, canceled leaves with the police. That was very important. The Tet holiday was coming up. Those leaves were canceled, and they stayed in place. If they hadn't done that, the communists would have overrun Saigon. So Vo Van Ba's reporting, though dismissed by the U.S. Embassy, saved Saigon. When I arrived in Saigon in 1969 and was assigned to this all-source intelligence unit, this analytical unit that was so plugged in, one of my first jobs was to analyze a newly captured communist document. It was known as Resolution 9. Resolution 9 was the communist post-mortem, after-action report on the Tet Offensive, which they'd launched the previous year. And in this document, they acknowledged to themselves that it had been a disaster militarily. They had lost innumerable forces in their attacks on the U.S. Embassy and targets from way across the country. They were decimated. What they'd done is put Viet Cong southern units in the forefront of the offensive, and they'd been blown apart by allies, by South Vietnamese and American forces. And so in this Resolution 9, they toted up the costs and decided it would take 2 years to recoup those losses. We captured this document in its entirety. Actually, U.S. military did. But I was assigned with my little analytical unit to determine if it was bona fide. That if this document wasn't some manufacture from the communists, some effort on their part to mind fake us, I had determined its authenticity. And I knew that we had an agent in place who could help verify it. And that was Vo Van Ba. And indeed he did. He verified that this document was the real thing. And by the way, he proved once again that he was the real thing, because he could accurately reflect on this incredible document. Now, why was that document so important? Because basically, it gave President Richard Nixon a rationale for Vietnamization. That's the policy of withdrawing Americans from the war and substituting Vietnamese forces for American ones. It was to be Nixon's policy to get us out of Vietnam. What this resolution told us was that we had a 2-year window in which the communists were going to cut back on major military activities. A 2-year window in which we could begin to withdraw American forces and safely move into place Vietnamese forces to do the heavy fighting. It was pure gold. Pure gold. Imagine. Look, those of you out there who have no knowledge of intelligence, I'm telling you, as an intelligence operative, this is what it's all about. You get a piece of intelligence that is so earth-shaking, it enables you to program an entire policy. Vietnamization, in part, was justified on the notion, or but through the notion, the communists were on the ropes, and that we had this 2-year window that Resolution 9 talked about. The fact that we use Vo Van Ba to authenticate the document only increased his value. And because his value was so important, we knew that he was, Jesus Christ, we got somebody right in the center of things who can report the war. And by the way, what I'm telling you has only now become apparent, and I'll talk to you later about how we know or have confirmed how important Vo Van Ba was. But in any event, we knew it was important. As of my arrival in Vietnam, and because of my involvement with the authentication process for this document, I became intimately acquainted with Vo Van Ba, this prisoner. I'm not his case officer. I was not a case officer. I wasn't his handler. But I had the information necessary to evaluate his information, his intelligence, and to get more from him. So I began writing requirements for Vo Van Ba. That's basically questionnaires to be used by his case officers to question. And as time went on, they invited me to begin meeting with them. In 1971, I had a 3-day session with Vo Van Ba. And I was able to, through that discussion, which was recorded by a CIA officer who had a tape recorder, it was a very important session. Vo Van Ba's bona fides were being questioned at the time because he failed some polygraph tests, because Vietnamese could never quite do well on polygraph tests. They could actually beat them because their sense of where truth lay was an ambiguous zone, which was not adequately handled by a polygraph. Suffice it to say that I was able to determine through this 3-day session that there should be no question about Vo Van Ba's continuing value. That session I had with him put him back at the center of things, back in everybody's best agent book. I want to tell you about Vo Van Ba. He reminded me of a crimp of barbed wire. He was all sharp edges. He had a rust-colored skin. His face, how do you put it? His face looked like a mortar round with a piece of rubber stretched over it, tight. Okay? You got it. High cheekbones. And this may sound melodramatic, but stay with dear old Frank for a minute. I mean, one of the things that always struck me about Vo Van Ba was the eyes. They were constantly darting from side to side. In fact, it was distracting talking to him because he didn't seem to look at you in the face. And I came away from one session thinking that he was so paranoid and nervous about people around him, he was constantly searching his environment, his immediate environment, for hidden microphones and whatever it is. Just indulge me in this. That was the way I came to view him, one of the ways. He had a photographic memory. A photographic memory in a spy is pretty damn important. He could look at a document and he could then walk away from it and regurgitate it verbatim to his CIA case officer, to whoever was handling him at the time. Now, we had to be very careful in our handling of Vo Van Ba. His case officers were American white guys. His Vietnamese police case officers were Vietnamese. They could meet with him in Tay Ninh province. The white guys couldn't. So we would have to, when I met with Vo Van Ba, and it became an increasingly frequent ritual, because I was brought in to use the information I had to tease out information from him. But we would have to bring him to Saigon for a meeting in a safe house there. And this is the way it was orchestrated. And I love it. It's so cinematic, but it's true. What would happen is this. Vo Van Ba would go to a field hospital or a hospital in Tay Ninh City, and he would go to a pre-designated room. He would climb on a gurney, pull a sheet over himself, pretend to be a dead person, and his Vietnamese handlers would come in disguised as orderlies. They would wheel the gurney out, take it to the airfield, and Vo Van Ba would arrive in Saigon with no one the wiser, okay? When he got off the aircraft, he would put on a male alzai, that's a male dress, but actually it made him look like a woman because he would then put on a wig, false hair, that would have shamed a Saigon pole dancer. He was, very shiny and whatever. And then he would arrive in the company of his American case officer at the safe house. And if I had been scheduled to interrogate him, there I was, to meet with him. He was very persnickety about what he was deserved. He loved Budweiser beer. It was a rumor in Saigon that we had, the U.S. Air Force, had dropped Budweiser along the Ho Chi Minh Trail system to slow down North Vietnamese infiltrators. Vo Van Ba apparently bought into this story, and so his sense of irony prompted him to become a lover of Bud. And so before he'd begun unloading the goods on us and telling us what he knew, we'd have to give him a Budweiser. And he also loved Salem cigarettes. That's because, and again, his sense of irony was working, Ho Chi Minh's favorite cigarette was Salem. And when Ho Chi Minh met with his own cadre and followers, he had one pocket with Bastos in a Vietnamese cigarette, he had the other pocket with Salem. And when his followers weren't looking, he'd have a Salem. Well, Vo Van Ba figured what was good for Ho Chi Minh was good for him, and so he asked for a Salem cigarette before he'd start talking. So after he'd gone through this ritual, Salem, cigarettes, Budweiser, he'd give us what we needed. The communists themselves, after the war, examining captured documents and after interrogating prisoners, determined that Vo Van Ba was the most dangerous agent who had ever worked against the communist cause. I will say it again. He was the most dangerous agent who had ever worked against the communist cause. Not by an American assessment, but by Hanoi's own assessment. Post-war security cadre researched his record and said, basically, what the hell? How did this guy fox us? How did he deceive us? They conceded, and their research has been published, that Vo Van Ba delivered every secret of the communist command, and I'm talking about major secret, from 1965 to the last days of the war. And I want to tell you something, those of you who think you know the war and know the history of the war and how things developed. You got to take account of Vo Van Ba. And his record, by the way, is only now becoming apparent as Hanoi publishes its own findings on his operation. And it should change the way all of us view the war. Because basically, Vo Van Ba brought us the goods on everything the communists were doing. The Tet Offensive, he authenticated this Cosman, which told us that Vietnamization was a good idea. He predicted the attacks of 1972, certainly in the Tay Ninh area. And most importantly, and you gotta laugh at this, in fact, I love it. Most importantly, he told us what Henry Kissinger was doing in Paris in the secret negotiations with late Octo. Now, you remember, late Octo and Kissinger basically, between themselves, put together the Paris Peace Agreement that went into effect in 1973. But Kissinger was very secretive, and he didn't let anyone know, except the president himself and a few intimates, what was going on. But the communists and late Octo were not so discreet, and they would circulate among their own cadre the progress reports on the Paris talks. And when Vo Van Ba would go to the communist command in Tay Ninh province, he'd receive those briefings. So what he did was to bring us what he knew from his sources, the communist sources, what Kissinger was doing. So the CIA was able to figure out what Kissinger was doing through Vo Van Ba. And how I played into the picture is that when the Paris Peace Accords were coming to a conclusion, I was back at CIA headquarters briefly as an analyst for North Vietnamese policy. I was there for just several months before I went back to Saigon for my final tours. And I knew Vo Van Ba backwards and forwards from my experience in the field with him. And so when I began reading his reports, I was writing for the President's Daily Brief or contributing to those who were, et cetera, et cetera. I began writing little tidbits of information that went to the President of the United States that indicated we were on the verge of a breakthrough in Paris. And the tip-off was a report that Vo Van Ba brought us, and it was echoed in other sources, that indicated the North Vietnamese were about to give up their standing demand for Thieu, the resignation of Nguyen Van Thieu, as a precondition to any peace agreement. They said, we don't need that anymore. We'll let Thieu stay in place. We'll give you a ceasefire. That's basically what they told Kissinger. And that's what we picked up from Vo Van Ba at CIA headquarters, that the communists had changed their negotiating strategy. I wrote this into a report for the president, which went into the President's Daily Brief. Kissinger was so upset that he sent word that whoever had written this shouldn't be doing his work anymore, that he was overstepping the line. And the CIA decided that I would be better served, they would be better served if they sent me back to Vietnam, and that's why I went back to interrogate the prisoner, Nguyen Van Thuy. It's a insider story, but it goes to how important Vo Van Ba was. He also did something else that was critically important. In October 1972, Vo Van Ba discovered that Kissinger had given away the store in Paris. He discovered this because the communists were reporting that to their own cadre, and he picked up that noise. And he gave us a report, gave the CIA and the South Vietnamese police a report saying that Kissinger had agreed to leave the entire North Vietnamese army in the South in order to secure a ceasefire. Now, this was dynamite. No one knew that we were going to leave this North Vietnamese army, 140,000 strong, in South Vietnam in any coming peace agreement. Vo Van Ba told us this. His report was sent directly to Nguyen Van Thieu, the president of South Vietnam, when it arrived in October 1972. Thieu was infuriated. He realized he was being sold out by Kissinger, and he said, screw you, I'm not cooperating with this peace agreement, this peace process. So he moved away from it. The North Vietnamese discovered this. They withdrew, and suddenly the peace process was on the verge of collapsing because of Vo Van Ba's report that was sent to Nguyen Van Thieu. Well, as a result of this crisis, Nixon decided that he would have to do something to get things back on course. And that thing was the bombing of North Vietnam. He resumed the bombing in December of 1972 to make the South Vietnamese and to understand that we were still on their side. We weren't going to sell them out. And also, it was a way of putting pressure on the North to return to the negotiating table. And that's what happened. So, for a moment, Vo Van Ba's reporting threatened to derail the negotiating process throughout the entire ceasefire period, 2 years. Vo Van Ba kept delivering reports to us that told us what the communists were thinking. And from time to time, I met with him, supplementing the work of his regular case officers to elicit critical intelligence. During the last weeks of the Vietnam War, Vo Van Ba did something extraordinary. On April 8, 1975, 3 weeks before the collapse of the country, he delivered through his case officers a report that told us this. He said, the communists will never negotiate an ending to this war. They mean to take Saigon by force. And most important, he told us that all the talk of negotiations, any feints in that direction by Hanoi, were fake. They were not to be taken seriously because they weren't going to negotiate an ending. They weren't going to accept a negotiated ending. They'd gone that way before, the communists had. They'd done that in 1954 and had been sold out by their lights. They'd lost what they thought they'd gotten on the battlefield, lost at the negotiating table. In 1973, they thought they'd won, and yet 2 years later, they're still facing resistance from the South Vietnamese. So they weren't going to negotiate anything at this point. They were going to take Saigon by force. And the reason this was so important, folks, this new information, is that the ambassador to Saigon, Ambassador Graham Martin, was delaying any preparations for an evacuation in the belief that a negotiated ending was possible. Vo Van Ba was telling us, as of the first week of April 1975, last week of the month of the war, nothing going to happen. There was going to be no negotiated ending. Martin refused to believe it. I went bonkers because I knew that Vo Van Ba was the most trustworthy agent we ever had. And by the way, Ambassador Martin was an amazing man. And he had come to relish Vo Van Ba's reporting, this great spy inside the communist command, because it reinforced his notion that the communists were vulnerable, that they were weak, that they could be exploited. And so he viewed Vo Van Ba as walking proof that the right was with our side and that the communists were exploitable, okay? So when he dismissed Vo Van Ba's reporting, I was blown away, because this agent had always been pure gold for Martin, part of his belief system. I kept going to the ambassador. I was, by this point, his principal military briefer and the senior CIA analyst on the scene for communist intentions. So I wasn't playing out of school. This was my job, to persuade the Ambassador Martin what was going on. Martin had been a fan of Vo Van Ba's, so that he was resisting Vo Van Ba's warnings stunned me. And on April 17th, 2 weeks, basically 10 days before the end of the war, with evacuation planning stalling, Martin believing there was going to be a negotiated settlement and what have you, I called Vo Van Ba out of the bush. I think he was due in for debriefing anyway, but I piggybacked the debriefing and I asked Vo Van Ba all the questions that Martin was debating with me about. Would the communists negotiate an ending to the war? No, Vo Van Ba said, taking a sip of his beer. Will the communists seize Saigon? Yes, he said, militarily. When will they do it? There's a slight delay. They will see Saigon before the start of the rainy season, which was May, and so around the end of April, which is what happened. He also told us they would bring airstrikes in on the city. The North Vietnamese had never used their air force in the South, but we knew they had picked up in the past few weeks lots of abandoned South Vietnamese aircraft. And sure enough, there were indications that they were training to use these aircraft. Vo Van Ba told us this. He said communists had set up radar on Black Virgin Mountain northwest of Saigon to help with these airstrikes. This, friends, was the mother lode, the most important report that Vo Van Ba had ever delivered at a moment when intelligence was everything. Everything. Because the evacuation was stalling on the premise the communists would negotiate exactly what Vo Van Ba said was not going to happen. I went back to the embassy after receiving this report, and I said, we must disseminate. I said this to my boss, the CIA station chief, and to the ambassador. I said, we've got to disseminate this. And they said, no, let's not disseminate it. And I was stunned. And I warned my immediate boss, the CIA station chief, his name was Tom Polgar. I said, if we don't disseminate this, we'll be seen as suppressing intelligence, some words to that effect. Remember, I'm this young guy, and I'm telling the ambassador and station chief, you can't suppress this report. So finally they agreed to let me send it out through operations channels, that's the sewer belt in the CIA. And when it reached CIA headquarters, everybody recognized it for the dynamite report it was. They upgraded it, sent it to the president and to Admiral Noel Geiler, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Forces in the Pacific. Geiler was so exercised by this report, he began planning in earnest, for an accelerated airlift, including a helicopter airlift. He sent word to Saigon that changes should be made to the embassy's courtyard so that large helicopters could land there. Admiral Geiler, who was in charge of evacuation planning from the military side, based in Honolulu, when he received this report from Vo Van Ba, pointing to no negotiations, an attack on Saigon, he accelerated planning for a helicopter airlift and a general evacuation. And what he also did was to dictate to Martin that changes should be made to the physical compound at the embassy so that large helicopters could drop into the courtyard if necessary. And you may say, well, why is that important? Because we had to use that courtyard on the final day to complete the evacuation. And up to the time that Geiler sent his orders to Saigon to modify the compound, there were guy wires and electrical wires. There were all this stuff inside the courtyard tree that would have prevented the landing of those helicopters. So those of us, folks, who got out of Saigon the last moments of the war on a helicopter owe our lives to Vo Van Ba. Yeah, that's how important that report was. What happened to this fantastic agent, this hero, this nationalist hero, who gives the lie to the fact that there were no dedicated South Vietnamese heroes? Of course there were. There were many, many, many. But this was the hero of them all. What happened to him? 2 weeks before the end, just about the time I was meeting with him and getting the report from him, a CIA friend of mine, Jim Lewis, was captured by the North Vietnamese. He was out just north of Saigon, about 40 miles out, at the last Saigon defense line, and he was captured by the enemy. He knew about Vo Van Ba, and under interrogation, betrayed him. There was also a Vietnamese operative who had worked with Vo Van Ba in the past, had been an interpreter, and he too was captured and gave up Vo Van Ba to the enemy. I had thought in my last meeting with Vo Van Ba that he was going to be evacuated, but I was not in charge of the operational side, the mechanics of the Vo Van Ba case. So I didn't have any duty or involvement in his evacuation planning. But in the final discussion with him, I was led to believe he was going to leave. The Hanoi security people who later analyzed the Vo Van Ba case using captured documents and whatever, this was years later, they decreed that Vo Van Ba had been ordered to stay by the CIA, not to evacuate, that he'd been ordered to stay. I can tell you that was not part of the discussion I had with him. So if he was ordered to stay, that order came around me or in a later exchange between Ba and a CIA case officer. But he stayed shortly after the capture of Saigon by the communists. He was tracked down by enemy security cadre. They threw him into prison. And rather than be subjected to torture and interrogation, he hung himself by his belt. Remember the American Revolution? There was a spy who died for the cause, Nathan Hale. Vo Van Ba is the Nathan Hale of the nationalist cause in Vietnam. And after the war, the North Vietnamese published and continue to publish their research on Vo Van Ba's case. And it reveals what I knew in real time but couldn't write about in my own memoir at length. I mentioned my meetings with Ba, but I had to disguise them up to disguise his name. I mentioned the dates I met with him, the intelligence he gave us, but I couldn't discuss operational details, how we reached him, how we dealt with him, and so forth. That's all available now on the open market because of the North Vietnamese, or I should say, Hanoi security people's research on this case. And historians who are listening to me now should pay attention to those research papers out of Hanoi. Because what Vo Van Ba did was to help write the final years of the war. And not just the final years, from 1965 onward. You cannot write the history of the Vietnam War without taking account of what this brilliant man, this guy with a photographic memory who died for his cause, did for the nationalist side. And in part, the fact that his intelligence was available and often wasn't acted upon should also affect our judgment of American and Vietnamese policymakers. And it was my profound privilege to have operated on the fringes of the Vo Van Ba operation. Again, I wasn't his case officer. One of the Vietnamese police officers who did operate with him has written his own account and has described my interactions with Vo Van Ba. He now lives in Orange County. He was captured after the war and spent 17 years in a communist concentration camp because of his work with Vo Van Ba. So, keep that name in mind, those of you who are aficionados of the war. And remember, the nationalist cause had a hero in its ranks who changed the course of many important moments in the war and probably saved the helicopter evacuation, ensured that it would occur when it did and as efficiently as it did.